Log on, tune in, find out. Another good idea from Cambridge.
Well, a very warm welcome to the first Faraday Institute Research Seminar of Michaelmas term. And I hope you've got the poster or seen the poster with all the seminars of the term, the public lecture and so on. So do feel welcome to come to anything you can make and that interests you that we're doing during the course of the term. It's a great privilege now to introduce Professor Robin Gill, who is Michael Ramsey Professor of Modern Theology at the University of Kent at Canterbury. He is the first holder of that chair, which of course was established in honour of the late Archbishop Michael Ramsey. And Professor Gill has held a post of Professor in Applied Theology at the University of Newcastle upon Tyne. He's particularly interested in Christian ethics and also the sociology of the church, with interesting books with titles like The Myth of the Empty Church, apart from his books on ethics. He's been on the advisory board of the Archbishop of Canterbury on medical ethics and on theology, and he's currently a member of the BMA Medical Ethics Committee, and he's been a member of the Medical Research Council's Stem Cell Steering Committee, president for the Society of the Study of Christian Ethics, and chair of the British Sociological Association's Study Group of Religion. So it's a great pleasure now to introduce Professor Gill, who's going to talk to us about the ethics of human enhancement.
Thank you very much indeed. And thank you for inviting me. It's nice to see some old friends here as well. Richard Collins was on my appointment committee at the University of Kent. And Derek Burke and I wrote a rather glossy book that churches telling how they should function properly, which I wouldn't say quite followed. There we go. However, we won't be talking about that today. Let me explain how I got into this. As you kind of mentioned, I've been on the BMA Ethics Committee now for 10 years, and it's been a great privilege being on that. It's a huge sense of, a huge place of learning. I think it really is the premier medical ethics committee in this country. There's 4 full-time people on it, all of whom are extremely well resourced. And as members of that, we've got people like John Harris, who was a good sparring partner, and Sheila McLean, and many others. It's a great place to learn. It's also where this particular talk derives from. Because you may know that last year, about this time, the BMA produced this booklet. It's called Boosting Your Brain Power, Ethical Aspects of Cognitive Enhancement. And up to this point, I haven't really given this area much thought. In fact, I'm not sure that many ethicists have given the area much thought. But what we slowly became aware of, through listening to a number of scientists, is that, well, things are changing and there are possibilities for the future which have yet to be inspected from an ethical perspective carefully. And that's how it all started, realizing the possibilities of the future. I'm not a scientist, and I'll be deferring to many of you in terms of the science behind many of these developments, and you could put me right about. Please do put me right about that. Now, my background is entirely as a social scientist and as a theologian and an ethicist, and it's from that perspective that I'll be talking. But one of the great things about the BMA Committee is you do need to listen to each other. The scientists, the medics, the lawyers, the philosophers, and me as the only theologian. We do have to listen to each other, and listen to each other very carefully. And particularly when we come across an area like this, which I think in ethical terms is still fairly novel, and we're still feeling our way around it and trying to feel, well, what is ethically appropriate and what isn't. When we launched this booklet at the Royal Institution last November, and that's where this talk derives from, speaking on the other side, so to speak, in a sort of debate, was John Harris, who just produced his latest book, which some of you may have seen, Enhancing Evolution. It's not a very heavy book, but I decided I wouldn't carry it on the train. But you get the flavour of it from that picture. And being John, he produced quite a provocative book, and a book that I'll be arguing, well, in part agreeing with him, but in quite large part disagreeing with him. But it certainly set the tone for the debate, and I find it a useful foil to make some of the points I want to do from it. In Oxford, you may be aware of the work of Nick Bostrom. I think very good work on enhancement, much more scientific than John or myself, and very detailed on the science, and to my lay ears quite impressive, but also quite libertarian on the ethical side, a bit like John, without full impact. Sometimes this debate is talked about as being the debate about human enhancement, sometimes about cognitive enhancement, just taking it one step further, sometimes about transhumanism. I think Nick Bostrom sometimes uses that term and looks forward, I think that's the way he does it, looks forward to the idea that we'll be producing what he calls transhumans in the future. Well, I'll come to that a little bit later. So my ear is let me see if I can make this work. Apologise, well, I don't really apologise for the slides. I'm afraid I've got my wife to do it, and I'm sort of not always in control of the slides, I have to say that, or particularly the pictures. I think Kara moved most of the dinosaurs from it. She's rather apt to use dinosaurs, especially when she's talking about theology, but there you go. I try and take them out. But, I came across this advertisement, and I thought, well, this actually is quite interesting, because it tells the difference between therapy and enhancement. This hearing aid, the revolutionary curious, now you really will hear better than ever before. Now, if that advertisement was claiming that you'll have your hearing restored, most of us would talk about that as being therapy. That you're returning to something you had previously, and now you'll be able to hear it just as you once heard before. But being a modest company, they're making a bit bolder claim of that, and they're saying that you now really will hear better than ever before. So presumably, if you wear this hearing aids, if their claims, of course, are scientific and accurate, and all that kind of thing, I'll leave that for you to judge. Presumably, I'll be able to hear people whispering over in that corner there, who I wouldn't normally have been able to hear, and that actually will be enhancement on what I had before. Presumably, somebody's making claims for spectacles. The spectacles which restore vision, which I think is what mine do. The world was getting a bit blurred. I thought I just needed reading glasses, and then of course my wife dragged me to the optician, and we found that I was an illegal driver, so I'd clearly reached that stage in life. And the world's been a bit clearer ever since. And I suppose, yes, I can remember it looking like this. I'm not sure it improves, but I can see it when it's restored, and I can see much more clearly than I used to, which is sometimes a benefit and sometimes not. But I don't think I've been given glasses which make my vision actually better than it was when I was young. I think it's been restored. So at least in principle, we can see the idea between therapy and enhancement. Well, yes, it very soon breaks down this distinction, because in some areas it's really going to be quite difficult to know. Supposing somebody actually, their eyesight becomes normal, but they never were actually normal in the first place. Normal in the sense of the mean average of the population. Now, for that person, is that therapy or is that enhancement? These definitions are pretty slippery. I think you can also see from this, I mean, this strikes me as absolutely fundamental, is that to say you're against human enhancement is obvious nonsense. you can't be wholly against human enhancement. Well, you just you can, but none of you be here today if you came by any form of transport. And if, like me, you use computers, you clearly can't claim that, and if you wear glasses, you clearly can't clear that. All sorts of things about us that we take for granted are clearly something to do with enhancement. In fact, I think none of us would be here because presumably education itself is a form of enhancement. It's certainly cognitive enhancement. I mean, if it's working, people are cognitively enhanced by it. So, since we're an educational institute, and all of you are educators, clearly we're products of enhancement. You can't, it's logical nonsense, I think, to be simply against enhancement. One has to make this point at the beginning. Unfortunately, when John and I did we did a radio debate on one of the Sunday morning programs, Broadcasting House it was, and I made this point at the very beginning of the broadcast, but it wasn't live, of course, and I made the point, you can't be against enhancement. Of course, they chopped all that, so that's very boring. So they chopped that, and instantly, so I went back to university and talked to the philosophers and said, no, everything you said was rubbish, because every time you drink a cup of coffee, that's clearly enhancement. Yeah, well, I said I made that point at the beginning, they just chopped it out. But I think one does have to make this point. I think theologians have sometimes got a very bad reputation for this, of simply being against it, if it's new. And in the area of biotechnology, I'm surrounded by theologians, and Derek in his area of genetically modified food certainly is. Theologians who just know it is wrong, full stop. Well, I think we have to be careful of these kind of big claims, and I think nothing annoys scientists more than for theologians to be making generalized dogmatic claims which take no account of the fact that they're already part of the process. I mean, it's after the disaster of the last 2 weeks, the Church of England is not perhaps in the best position to say the stock market is evil and, and that they never use hedge funds and all the rest of it. Yeah, it's not a good idea, is it? If you're going to criticise something and you're part of it, at least you've got to acknowledge that at the beginning. So what I'm talking about is not a total disagreement with people like John Harris or Nick Bostrom. Where I'll be asking questions is whether there are actually limits to enhancement, and whether we can actually establish ethical criteria for suggesting to us when those limits are reached. John helpfully produces his own position, in which I'm going to dissent from quite strongly, but it is at least a very clear position that those who seek to disallow any form of human enhancement need to show not simply that it is unpopular or undesirable or undesired, but that it is seriously harmful to others or to society, and that these harms are real and present, not future and speculative. So John, like me, has limits. If something can satisfy all of these criteria, that there are serious harms of harming others or to society, that these harms are real and present and not future and speculative, if we can show all those things, then John too is against forms of human enhancement that do these things. Now, I'm not going to agree with this. I'm going to draw the line a little bit earlier, in fact quite a bit earlier, and I am going to allow for harms that are still future, and in one sense could be described as speculative. But I take the force of what he's saying. It isn't simply good enough to stop something just because you don't like it, because you find it distasteful, because you find it yuck, all those kind of things. They don't seem to be good ethical grounds for saying no. Some ethicists defend that and say, no, yuck actually does tell us something about our instincts and where we are. I'm suspicious of that because I know that people find things yuck, which seem to me to tell me much more about them than about the thing itself. I mean, just think about something like length of hair, for example, that people have. People get very stroppy about that, don't they? And have very strong opinions about whether hair should be short or long. But we know that culturally that's very relative, and over time it's very relative. and these things change anyway. And what does it matter how long or short your hair is? But we do have feelings about this, but on the whole they tell me much more about myself than they do about what is ethically right or not. I don't personally think long or short hair is an ethical problem. Let me try to say why I think the line should be drawn a little bit earlier. I want to identify two types of ethical argument. The first is very familiar to you. It's incremental ethical argument. The usual way we argue in this context, and certainly John does this all the time, and I suppose all of us do it up to a point, is to argue something like this. Now, we all accept, or most of us accept, that computers are not wrong in themselves. They can be put to harmful uses, or they can be put to benign uses. They're a form of enhancement we've come to accept. We have to distinguish how they're used, but they're not wrong in themselves. Now, if we accept that, why then should we accept computers which become part of the body, which are put into people's bodies? Why don't we accept that? And if we accept that, why don't we accept other forms of modification of bodies? And if we accept that, then why, as I'll be arguing later, why are we against the idea of genetic manipulation of bodies, of enhancing bodies through genetic means? Now, this is an incremental argument. You're taking it step by step. You're saying, now we all accept this, why don't we accept that? And once we accepted that, why don't we accept this? And once we accepted this, why don't we accept that? It's an incremental style of what I want to be a bit flippant. It's cheese nibbling. So we start by having one little bit of cheese, and then another little bit of cheese, and then another bit of cheese, and then keep on with an extra slice of cheese, of course, until there isn't any cheese left in this argument. Now, we're aware of this incremental ethical argument, and we're aware sometimes that it's used in different ways. There's a very good example of this in the Times today, as I was reading coming up. An awful story about a mother and daughter, where the daughter is a heroin addict. And she was describing very accurately the incremental process involved in this. And forgetting or at least ignoring the whole argument about whether one thing leads to another, in the daughter's experience, she was talking about how she started, first of all, drinking as a child at 15, then trying cannabis, and then going on to cocaine, and then on to heroin, and then into injecting heroin. Now, she wasn't saying there was anything logically related. It wasn't a necessarily logical relationship between any of those activities. But what she says is she wouldn't have started that end if she hadn't started this end. And by doing it at that level there, the barriers were down for something just a little bit higher. And so it went through. Now, that doesn't foreclose that particular debate which is widely going on in our society about drugs and about how cannabis should be classified. And I suppose using her logic, you should then extend it backwards into alcohol as well. I understand that, but it does tell you what an incremental argument is about. It's moving to the next thing, because the next thing is very similar to the previous thing, but only just it's a bit different. We have exactly the same debate going on in the area of euthanasia at the moment, with people forever saying, well, we withhold treatment, you have a right as a patient to withhold treatment, why should you not then withhold nutrition hydration? Once you've held nutrition hydration, why shouldn't you then allow assisted suicide? Once you allow assisted suicide, why shouldn't you have involuntary suicide? And once you have involuntary suicide, why shouldn't you have suicide for certain groups, euthanasia for certain groups, babies with deformities and so forth, or old people who have Alzheimer's? You can see the ethical argument. It isn't that we can't avoid this, but at some point, all of us, all of us at some point have to say, no, we've actually crossed a threshold at that point. The difference between myself and John is we probably crossed the threshold at different points. It's not that we don't have thresholds. I don't defy anybody not to have some threshold in this particular debate, or in fact in most moral debates. The other type of argument I want to call attention to is the issue of proportionality. The popular name for the first one is slippery slope. I'm not very keen on people using the term slippery slope because people do pay good money to go on slippery slopes at this time of year. So I'd rather call it incremental arguments. The other type is proportional ethical arguments. When does an argument become disproportionate? This struck me very forcibly with what I have come to call since the paperclip argument. It was a television program some years ago now, but the premise of the program was about business ethics, and it was really basically saying this. We're all basically thieves because which one of us doesn't pinch paperclips? Which one of us doesn't actually appropriate or steal, if you like, paperclips from the office? So in terms of business ethics, the person who takes millions of pounds from the business, it is a thief, but so are you a thief because you take the paperclips and you don't pay for them. So the paperclip argument, it's quite a seductive argument. It's probably good for the soul to be reminded of our own many discretions. But one of the things that is so obvious about this is that it's what I regard as a disproportionate argument. If we're really going to use the word steal for both somebody who takes paperclips and somebody who takes millions of pounds, then maybe our vocabulary has become a bit distorted at that point. And there must be some difference in proportion, or at least some allowance for proportion, if we're going to substantiate a proper ethical argument. Now these are the two styles of argument that I want to draw attention to in this particular context. There's the paperclips. What's missing from this? What's missing from these two styles of argument? It's not that I think disproportionate arguments are not sometimes helpful. It's not that I'm going to argue that incremental arguments are also useless all the time. I think neither of those things. But I do think there's something missing from the styles of argument here. And at this point I've become more of a theologian than an ethicist. Because I think what is often missing from arguments is what theologians have called for many years, many decades, many centuries, arguments based upon the common good. Arguments about the common good are sort of coming back a bit more into fashion. But their history is one of concern for wider society and a realization that if you simply stick arguments at an individual level all the time, you'll actually miss something which is much more important, or is something that's hugely important. A very good example of this is in the debate that's currently raging about climate change. Now, I'm not going to tell you the rights and wrongs of the science of climate change arguments. It's not my business. But let me just assume for the moment that the scientists who do believe that human action has contributed to climate change, let's just suppose that they're right. I'm not going to argue about that. That's for you to do. I'm just going to take that as a given for the moment. If that is the case, if we are to address climate change, then we will need fairly radical human action. In fact, we're going to require action that disadvantages almost everybody. If we simply work at the individual level in terms of climate change, we never get to the point of making any changes. It's notoriously difficult to get people to change behaviour based upon future generations. As the joke goes, what have they ever done for us? But to understand the kind of moral change we need to make in terms of individual behaviour in terms of climate change, we have to have some commitment to something beyond ourselves individually. And theologians have usually call this the notion of common good. That the common good is distinct from individual goods. And that individual goods, however much you aggregate them, still don't add up to the common good, and notoriously in areas like macroeconomics and macrotechnology. In fact, I suspect, again, what we've seen over the last 2 weeks in terms of economics, and I'm no economist, has shown that there is a common good, and that maybe the kind of actions that governments around the world are now finally taking will disadvantage us in the short term, maybe even the medium term. But the disaster for everybody, if we didn't take them, it would make things 100 times worse. So there is an argument, at least that will have some effect upon us. Climate change doesn't even work like that. It's probably not us. In fact, we'll probably actually here rather benefit from climate change. We'll have a much more Mediterranean climate for the rest of our lives, which for us would not be very pleasant. Certainly if I was still working at Edinburgh as I did for years, I'm sure I'd be praying for climate change all the time. But no, it's not the point, is it? The common good says that sometimes we have to consider the good as a whole, the common good, the good for all people, including future generations, and not simply the individual goods of individuals within that. And that these two can sometimes conflict. I find this is normally very often missing from for this particular debate about human enhancement. Let me try and show you why. I'm going to take 2 examples. Example number 1 is performance in enhancing drugs in sport. Or it could be examinations, but let's just stick to sport for a moment because it's more fun. One of John Harris's arguments is this, that in terms of performance enhancing drugs for athletes, manifestly attempts to stop athletes taking performance enhancing drugs has failed, or at most partially succeed. He simply says, why bother? Why do it? If individual athletes want to take drugs, and they want to take risks with their own bodies, why not let them? Why don't we just simply say, forget about all these attempts to stop athletes taking drugs, just let them, and let them decide for themselves whether they think this is a wise thing to do or not. Now, whenever he says this, somebody always pops up and says, well, the reason is quite simply because it's not fair. It's not fair that we should allow athletes to take an unfair advantage over their opponents. John rightly argues this. He says, no, it's the present situation which is unfair, not the future. If everybody can equally take drugs if they want to, if they choose to, then it isn't unfair anymore. What's unfair is actually the present situation. Because you suspect very strongly that even in the Olympics we've just had, there are people who are clever enough to take drugs without getting caught. Clearly some were caught and they weren't very clever. But presumably there are ways of evading, again, you're the scientist, not me, there are ways of evading drugs detection for certain drugs, which will give you an advantage as an athlete over other athletes. So what he argues is, no, it's the present situation which is unfair, not a situation where you simply said, right, taking drugs is allowed, you make the choice. And I think he has a very good argument. I think that is a good argument in individual terms. And most of his arguments are excellent in individual terms. So what's missing from it? What's missing from that particular argument? I think the answer comes back. What's missing is actually the common good. Just imagine it. That we actually say, right, in future we're going to allow weightlifters to take steroids. It's up to them. If they want to take steroids, I mean, steroids are certainly going to build up muscle. It's certainly going to help them. Probably quite a few of them are taking already, just evading detection. But in future we're simply going to say to all weightlifters, right, you decide whether you want to take them or not. The trouble with that argument is once you've said that, and you really can show that this is a drug which really does enhance performance, but also has very serious consequences for the individual, that anyone from that point onwards who wants to be a weightlifter has to take steroids. This seems to me to be fairly obvious. Because even somebody who trains magnificently and really builds up can still get an advantage by taking the steroids. So the net consequence is that everybody who is a weightlifter has to take steroids. So actually, everybody is finally disadvantaged by that. In terms of the common good, it simply isn't good practice to say that to make that change, which allows everybody to do it, and everybody then has to do it if they're going to do that. Of course, they don't have to be weightlifters, but if they choose to be, they have to take them. Now, presumably that's the reason why we, over the centuries, have tried to eliminate some of the more barbaric features from sport. Bare-knuckle boxing, or sort of coming back again in cage fighting, I gather, or to take it on further, gladiators. Now, if, on John's argument, well, if a person decides they want to be a gladiator, and they're happy to take the risk of getting a head chopped off as a gladiator, they can make that choice whether to be gladiator or not. Why not let them? And then we can enjoy watching them killing each other, if that's what you want to do. You don't have to be a gladiator. My argument is simply this, is what we've decided as a society is that we don't think that's the sort of thing a civilized society should do. We actually think it debases society at large to allow that to happen. Now, we eliminated that one from a long time ago. But previous civilizations thought that was a civilized thing to do. We've decided not. We've decided on moral grounds, and I think we've decided on common good grounds. That even if the individuals involved choose to do it, they still shouldn't be doing it because of the wider impact upon society at large. So my argument in this context is that if you take the individual arguments, then individually it's difficult to show why they're wrong. But if you actually start looking at society at large and start arguing about the common good, then I think you can come back with rather different ideas. Let me take another example. And this is one that will be very familiar to you. Human reproductive cloning. Now I'm just going to assume for the moment it's possible. Listening to scientists, I'm not entirely sure it is possible, but let's just assume that it either is possible or will become possible in scientific terms to have human reproductive cloning. And clearly this is a very advanced form of enhancement. Now we're into what Nick Bostrom calls transhumans. So we're actually able to create human beings through cloning that wouldn't have been able to be created by natural means. What's wrong with this? When you listen to people arguing, and some people in the church have done this, it's easy to fall into certain traps. Often I hear at this point people saying, this is wrong because of identity. That by producing somebody who is a clone of yourself, you actually have create serious problems for the identity of that person who is a reproduction of yourself. And without any of the normal variations we find in nature. I think that's a very poor argument, personally. As it happens, I suspect one or two of you are, I'm a twin. I'm a dizygotic twin. I've got a sister, so clearly not a monozygotic twin. But I've got an interest in twins, and aware of some of the identity problems that twins have. And I can imagine from that what a monozygotic twin relationship might be. Well, actually monozygotic twins, of course, have a much closer identity than diachronic individuals created through human reproductive cloning. They've got similarities in time, they've got the same womb, they've got probably much in common in terms of their upbringing, and of course genetically they're identical. And yet, when we've met, or some of you may be monozygotic twins. When we met monozygotic twins, they don't normally have a problem of identity. Or not a serious enough problem of identity to think they shouldn't exist. And what about conjoined twins? And particularly conjoined twins who've never been separated. And there are a few in the world. And television being television, they'd like to produce programs about them. And now, that's about as close as you're ever going to get in terms of identity, isn't it? So you're clearly a monozygotic twin, you've got a shared womb, you've got a shared upbringing, and you've got a shared continuing social environment. You're permanently attached. But if you've ever watched those programs, it's very obvious they have different personalities and different identities, and often quite different tastes. So there we have it in nature, one of the closest relationships of a conjoined monozygotic twin, just about as close as you can ever get. Whereas human reproductive cloning is not going to get nowhere near this. Adults reproducing themselves as children in different ages, different wombs, different education, different environments. Richard Dawkins made a joke and said he would quite enjoy having a human reproductive cloning himself. My sort of joke back again is, I bet he'd turn out to be an evangelical Christian. So identity isn't the problem, it seems to me, and I think John's absolutely right about that. So what is the problem with human reproductive cloning? Why don't we allow it? Why don't we simply say, well, why not allow it? Another argument is to say, well, actually there isn't any very good reason for it. There might be some good reason in the animal kingdom, and particularly when you have a rare animal, or we have an animal that's been already genetically modified to produce human milk or something like that. There might be a reason there for wanting reproductive cloning, but there isn't a good reason with human beings. After all, we're not. Even if the thought that you want to reproduce yourself, even if that's allowable, it's clearly not even true, is it? Because you're not going to reproduce yourself. You're merely going to reproduce another human being who has the same genes as you, but not is the same as yourself. And is it really a good idea that we should want to do that? I mean, is that a good reason? John says, well, wait a minute, I think, in a way, all parents want to do that. That's why we have children in the first place. Because in a sense, we're reproducing ourselves. So it's not a good argument simply to be using that as an argument against human reproductive cloning. There isn't a good reason for it. There isn't a therapeutic reason for it. Well, there might be. There might be a therapeutic reason for it if you particularly want to avoid some genetic disability in terms of your partner. That might be a reason for wanting to do it. Though I have to say it's not the most obvious route to take. Pre-implantation genetic diagnosis strikes me as a much more obvious and safer way of doing things, but that's another story. None of these individual arguments work desperately well. It's only when you put everything together you can begin to see what's wrong. What you're actually saying, if you allow for human reproductive cloning, is that you do something to another person without their consent, you haven't consented to this, for no obvious reason, and when the risks are totally unknown. Now that's why I think human reproductive cloning is wrong. It is wrong. It is wrong to even attempt to do it for those reasons. Now you clearly haven't got the person's consent. You never do, in fact, of course, when you create another human being, have their consent. There's no particular good reason for doing it, other than curiosity. Well, again, I suppose we do sometimes do things for no good reason. But add to that as well, the risks are unknown, although they're quite well known in the animal kingdom, and we know the risks are quite high. When you put all those three things together, that you're doing something without consent, without any good reason, and when you don't know the risks, you then, I think, have to ask yourself, should you be allowing that kind of thing in terms of the common good? My answer again is, no, I don't think you should. It's fine to do things with consent even if there are high risks, well, we do that. I mean, people choose to go skiing off-piste or what have you, or to do dangerous sports. You may think they're foolish, but we normally don't want to stop people doing it. We might warn them, but people have a choice there. You might do things out of curiosity, again with consent. But to have no consent, no good reason, and when you can't tell what the dangers are, knowing that there are dangers in the animal kingdom, then it seems to me you shouldn't be doing this in the first place. It's at that point, I think, where the proportionality of the whole thing has scaled over into something I would simply say, no, clearly you shouldn't be doing that in those terms. Yeah, there's the clinic. So, what? I don't want to go on too long because I do want to allow you some time to come back. I'll talk for another three or four minutes. But I do want to make one or two other points because other points are raised by this debate. And again, there are quite important differences in myself and John at this level. One of the things lying behind this debate is our understanding of personhood, our understanding of what it is to be a person, what it is that makes us as persons special. John's answer is quite simple and straightforward, is that persons properly so-called are individuals capable of valuing their own existence. It's quite a neat definition and does allow them to make certain decisions in ethical terms. But this is primarily, when push comes to shove in this book, this is what he thinks makes a person a person. And so at this level, I profoundly and utterly disagree. It's not that I don't think valuing yourself is unimportant, but I don't think it's what makes you a person as a person. And in fact, what's wrong with this for me is, well, supposing somebody doesn't value themselves. There are plenty of people who don't value themselves. Now, I'm sure they're diminished as a person, but are they no longer to be considered a person when they no longer value themselves? What about somebody who has Alzheimer's and has lost memory of themselves in that sense? Are they not people? What about somebody at the earlier stage of life? They haven't yet learned to value themselves. What age do you start valuing yourself? All these seem to me to be unanswered questions here. Allow us what I think is a dangerous liberty in terms of what we can then do to this non-person. And that's what I worry most about in John's definition. Knowing that, like Peter Singer, he's sympathetic to the idea of infanticide and euthanasia at the other end of life. Now, I want to say as a theologian, no, I think you're at least in part a person because you are loved by others. And you'd expect me to say as a theologian, because you are loved by God. In fact, I think somebody who isn't loved by other people is seriously diminished as a person. But as a theologian, again, I'd always want to say to that person, you're still loved by God. You're always loved. You're not unloved as a human being. You are always loved. Now, I think that concept of person isn't what's going on here all the time. That's important. Of course what's going on here is important. Important that people do value themselves. I understand all that. But I don't think it's sufficient. What I want to say is that part of being a person, a very important part of being a person, is being loved by others. That's why, for example, we honour and respect dead bodies. This is somebody who's still loved. They can't value themselves, clearly not, but we still love them, and we respect their dead body accordingly. This is why I think we love babies as well, in the same way, I mean, that we treat them as people, because they are loved, and seriously worried if they're not loved. So love of others seems to me to be an important part of how I define a person, but it's not in John's definition at all. Well, there we go, there's someone who loves, values himself. So what I'm arguing for in this context is not going to resolve all these issues. We're going to have to go through them individually, case by case, and I've only given 2 examples, that's all I've got time for. is that I think in this area, what it shows the need for in ethical terms is for less individualistic ethical thought is surely needed at this point. Instead, we need to promote a wider and deeper ethical discussion based upon what I believe is essential as a theologian, which is both compassionate care and the common good. I've talked less about compassionate care today than I have done about common good, but both seem to me to be absolutely vital to the doing of ethics. And only in this way then we're likely to tread wisely in such novel areas of ethics. Well, I've spoken long enough and let you ask questions.
Very much indeed. So, what questions have we got? Yes.
Human reproductive cloning. Perhaps I should say that I've been in medicine for over 60 years now, the last 21 of my practical experience as a cardiologist. But I've been very interested in medical ethics for the last 30 particularly. Human reproductive cloning, you said, I think, that there is no practical reason to do it. I believe somebody like John Harris, who is an amoral utilitarian, would or might say there is a good reason for doing it because it provides an opportunity for spare part surgery. If you get a bit of kidney failure or something and there's someone identical with you, you could always have one of his kidneys, couldn't you?
Yes.
Ethical problems there?
To keep this person in the bank, yes, I understand that.
Yeah, I've heard the argument. I mean, I'm sympathetic to human reproductive cloning in the earlier stages in terms of stem cell research, but only as the law as demands that must be before 12 days or whatever it is. But that's an area in itself of debate, and some of you will and won't agree with that. But I'm sympathetic in that area. Yeah, but by human reproductive cloning, we imagine a person who's actually born and somebody who's a person. And there, I think it becomes, in my terms, quite unimaginably unethical to think of somebody else being produced so that I may benefit from those spare parts. Yeah.
Right at the back.
I wanted to bring back to your example one, where you used sport
Yeah.
enhancement and argued that John Harris's arguments are for the individual and not for the common good.
Yes.
And how that would relate to cognitive enhancement or taking drugs
Yes.
to enhance yourself, where I think, from my understanding of John Harris, is that he argues that it is for the common good, in the same way that education is individually good, but it is also good for society, good for the communities that you live in, good for the world.
Yes.
And with the proviso that the drugs that you take don't have side effects that
Yes.
would be overtly harmful, in the same way that coffee has side effects, but it's generally reasonably well tolerated.
Yes.
Surely that is also for the common good if it's enhancing the overall populations.
I take his points about that one, and I think it's more difficult to argue directly against that in that way. I think you're absolutely right about that. I'm just a bit suspicious of a philosopher or even a theologian telling us that drugs don't have side effects. Listening to scientists, drugs normally have side effects.
Well, they do, but they're within acceptable levels.
And how do you find out? You find out presumably if you try them over a long period of time on a large population. Something like aspirin, for example, has been around for 100 years. Yes, we do know. I don't. You know the side effects of aspirin. They've been around for 100 years. They've had obvious benefits for the population at large. We know what the risks are and how to contain them, I think, and they've been taken by large numbers of people. But it's taken us that long to establish all of that. Now, John wants to do this for things like Ritalin and things like that. So we actually have a sizable, huge amount of children taking drugs, the drug Ritalin, on the theory that this is actually going to do them some good and doesn't have side effects. The only way we find out is to do it. And this is John's definition in the beginning, because they had to be immediate and known risks to stop you doing it. If they're merely future and speculative, as he would call them, get on with it, until you find them. That's a little too late then, isn't it?
You have kind of answered my question in that way, in that I think then there isn't actually a moral problem with enhancement. There isn't a problem with people taking caffeine. It's a problem with a specific drug. And that's quite a different argument if you don't really mind about certain drugs because you know their side effects, like coffee, caffeine.
Yes. Yeah.
You mind about Ritalin because you know the side effects.
Yeah, indeed. Well, I understand the problems, and I accept there is a vagueness there which I can't answer. Yeah. Yes, Keith Land.
Just to pick up the drug aspect,
Yeah.
I've worked in the drug industry for some time, and I have to emphasise that there is no drug without side effects.
Yeah.
And what we never know is how wide they're going to go.
Yeah.
So the way that argument was going, or your dialogue was going, it was almost saying, let's let any drug out into the population,
Yeah.
and then we'll find out whether there's anything wrong with them.
Yeah, and I don't
that's
accept that.
not acceptable.
No, I don't think it's acceptable either, no. Agree. Yeah. And of course people then use arguments like, well, what about alcohol or acid? Well, yeah, two wrongs don't make a right in my view. Alcohol does have serious problems. If we're starting from the very beginning, maybe we wouldn't have allowed alcohol, but there's no chance of stopping us now. Yeah. But that's quite a different argument to be saying, yeah, just allow people to do it and see what happens. Which I agree, I'm not so keen on that. There's no really good reason for doing it. And I'm not sure actually John does present really good reasons for the large amounts of children being on Ritalin, which it has to be to satisfy his argument. Yeah. Yes.
I wondered if I could press you a little bit more on your definition of personhood as
Right.
someone who is loved.
Yeah.
It just occurred to me to wonder what the implications of a definition like that are for the unborn child, and particularly the unwanted embryo,
Yes.
and whether that lays open limits that you might not want to accept.
Yes, I think it does have implications of that, and I think, and these are the problem. If you're wholly against abortion in any shape or form, as some of you may be, then I think the answer is that I suppose that every embryo is always loved, and if only by God, and then should never be aborted. I'm a gradualist, but it's a different argument. I mean, I'm not really going to start that one. I'm a gradualist, so I think your ethical responsibility grows and increases the later the term is, and so late abortions for me are much more problematic than very early abortions, let alone spontaneous abortions in the first trimester. But one of the factors in terms of a gradualist approach is indeed not just the wish of the parents, but the love of the parents as well in the situation. I've got 4 grandchildren now. They're all loved from the very first scan. There's no question of it. And yet other people are having abortions at that stage. So there is a difference, I think. But it is going to depend upon your prior beliefs in terms of abortion in the first place, and particularly your stance on whether you're an absolutist or a gradualist. But I'm not arguing about abortion.
No, sure, but I just wondered if it had implications for, say, late stage abortion.
Yes, it does for me, yes. Very much so.
What? I mean,
But
if a person who is someone who is loved,
Someone who is in their 3rd trimester
Yes.
can say, I don't want this baby.
Yeah.
There's no ethical reason why I can't.
Oh, right, I accept that. I'm not saying that being loved is my whole definition of being a person. I actually think John's definition is also quite important, and I also think there's a developmental process which is a person that gradually grows and becomes a person. That's built into the gradualist position. Yes. So I'm not saying it's the only criterion. No.
Okay.
Yes.
I just come back to this common good thing. I see the concept,
Yeah.
but in practice, every single innovation carries future risks.
Yes.
Some innovations, it's obviously risky.
Yes.
Others only emerge the risk after generations of use.
Yes.
How do you draw the line? Because if you're strict about it, you shouldn't allow anything new.
Clearly, and one of the features of allowing risk is we really do think the benefits outweigh the burdens, and that every medical procedure pretty well involves risk, doesn't it? Certainly any one that involves a surgeon involves risk, and yet many of us have surgery clearly because we believe that the benefits are going to outweigh the burdens of this and the risks.
So there's a reason for doing it. And indeed that is part of the calculation I think each one of us makes, is the treatment actually not offering us enough and becoming too burdensome, or is it worth taking a risk because we do think there's benefit from the treatment if it works? That's built into every medical practice pretty well. So it's not a judgment we're unfamiliar with, I think, in ethical terms. And some sort of balancing there, I think, is what most of us do.
Because most people thought that going faster than 4 miles an hour was detrimental to the common good.
Yes.
Well, maybe in terms of accident statistics, they were probably right. But
well, indeed. And I think it's dangerous when theologians start drawing lines too close, as I said at the beginning. I don't want to be. I'm not that kind of theologian who says no, never try anything new. On the contrary, I do want to try and things new. I enjoy innovation myself, but I also want to ask these questions about common good as well. Yeah. There's a question in the front.
Yes, I wanted to ask one question relating to John Harris's initial setting out of where he draws the line.
Yeah.
I noticed that he draws the line at behaviour actions that do serious harm to others.
Yes.
What he doesn't draw the line at is actions or behaviour that does serious harm to oneself. And I noticed you didn't actually challenge that.
No.
But isn't that one of the faults of the individualist ethic, that what you do is up to you?
Yes.
Whereas what you do not just affects the common good, it affects the people you live with, your social life and your interaction.
Yes, I agree with you, but I wouldn't let you make laws on that basis. I don't want to make laws that, on the whole, compel people to look after themselves.
But then the constant smoking debate, the government's compelling
everybody. And the seatbelt debate was a bit dodgy as well. And Americans took a different attitude, as any of you living in America will know. They're much more reluctant to make people wear seatbelts. They just like to penalise them in terms of their insurance if they're not wearing them. but it's a different stance, isn't it? Yeah, and I want to be mostly on the libertarian side on those kind of debates. But I do want to see its harm to others. Or, and John doesn't mention this, to the environment. And it's not in his definition, is it? So there's nothing about the environment there. It's just to other people or society. Well, I think the environment has to be in there as well. Yeah.
But there are knock-on effects, I think, which you're recognising to do with individual harm. And
yes.
Harm, like effect on the health service, smoking. And
yes. Yeah. I mean, I'm very wary about theologians trying to enforce morality for the good of individuals. I'm aware some of the damage that's been done historically in doing that. And so campaigns against censorship and pornography and prostitution and so forth. Now, the better parts of those have been the effect upon society at large and the effect upon other people, and the way that prostitution, for example, currently involves virtual enslavement of people from Eastern Europe and so forth. Now, I've found that those much more acceptable arguments than simply trying to force people to be good. On the whole, that isn't what God does to us. My understanding of God is that God gives us a lot of freedom and doesn't force us to be good. So I'm not quite sure why Christians want to force other people to be good. So, encourage them, yes, but not force them.
Good. Well, we might have time for one more at any rate. You had one for a while, I think.
What about this idea of people interacting with computers so that they become dependent on them, but then they become much more able? So we have a different kind of group of people emerging.
Yes.
That's a human enhancement, isn't it?
Yes, I'm one of them as well, yes.
What would you say about that?
Dependent.
What would you say about that?
I don't personally think that's any different from education or from wearing glasses or any of those kind of things, really.
But there's another step, isn't there? You have implants or chips.
Yes. Those things don't worry me too much either.
Kevin Warwick doesn't cause you too much concern.
Sorry?
Kevin Warwick and the kinds of implants.
Right.
Does he?
You have to remember what he actually does.
He's the chap who puts all sorts of things into his arm,
right,
and communicates with computers and
yes,
long vast distances.
Yeah, I can understand that. I'm not sure I could do that to himself. If he wants to do it to himself, that's no problem. I think in my terms, yes. But I mean, clearly, in terms of people with serious disabilities, there are huge potentials in that kind of technology, and it seems to me
yeah, I want to encourage that very strongly. Yeah.
Well now.
Okay.
Yeah, 2 o'clock. We do
Back
aim to
about
finish
2
at 2 because it
Yeah.
is a lunchtime slot and people
Yeah.
have to get back to their lectures, whatever else they have to do. So, a very big round of applause. Thank you very much.